Today we're talking about what white balance setting to use for your landscape photography. A question I often get asked when I'm leading landscape photography workshops is what white balance setting should I use on my camera when I'm taking a photo? And really my answer is pretty simple and straightforward. I rarely touch my white balance when I'm out photographing landscapes. But before I dive into what settings I use, let's talk a little bit about what white balance is in general. So the white balance setting on your camera is essentially trying to control for color cast in your images. Different types of light have different temperatures. So for example, a warm light tends to have an orange color cast to it, that warm feel. A cool light, and it creates sort of a blue color cast to your images. Now these temperatures are measured in a scale called Kelvin, with the lower side like 1000, 1500, 2000 being a very warm light, all the way up to around 10,000, which is a super bright blue sky, and everything falls in a range below. So when we're looking at white balance, we tend to measure it in Kelvin, and that's sort of our frame of reference. Now for example, an incandescent light bulb or golden hour, it's going to tend to hover around 3000, 3200 Kelvin, something like that, a warm light. Daylight, where we start to move into sort of a high noon setting where the sun's high overhead, that moves us into sort of the 5000, 5500 Kelvin range. Sort of right there in the middle of the scale. It's cooler than the warm tones that you might get at golden hour, but it's not as cool as you might get on a shady or cloudy day. As we move into a shady or cloudy day, moving up that Kelvin scale, we move into the 7500, 8000 Kelvin range. And then if you move into a clear, bright blue sky where you're getting that reflected light off the blue sky, you get close up into that 9500, 10,000 Kelvin range. Now, those are just approximations. These can shift depending on what else is going on in the sky. Is something reflecting off of something? Is it partly cloudy and things like that? Now, our eyes sort of make these adjustments. Our human body's pretty amazing. Our brain is pretty amazing. And it can see this and it can remove a lot of that color cast automatically, and our eyes are just doing it. So if you look at, like, say, a white coffee mug next to a glowing campfire, the campfire is obviously a warm light, but the mug in your eyes, your brain is making it, you can still tell that is a white mug, a white coffee mug, versus if you're standing in the shade of some rock with the same white coffee mug, your brain and your eyes are automatically making these adjustments. But when we get to the camera, it's not quite as smart as that, so we've got to consider our white balance settings. So because the camera's not as smart as our brain and doesn't necessarily as easily dynamically adjust these scenes and how you see things with this color cast, it needs a little bit of guidance. And so a camera typically has some general settings to help you with this white balance and you sort of nudge it in the right direction. It has automatic white balance, which we'll talk about in a minute. It tends to have an incandescent, which is for warmer colors. You set your white balance to incandescent and it's going to compensate for the scene being a warmer color cast. It has a daylight setting usually, which is when the sun is high overhead, sort of get you in that middle. Has a cloudy setting where things start to get a little cooler. It has a shade setting where things get even cooler still. And then it has a manual setting, which is where you can go in and actually set the specific Kelvin temperature that you want your camera set to. So those are the tools the camera gives us to sort of adjust this white balance. So let's first just talk a little bit about what the camera's doing when you choose one of these settings and go from there. Those settings all influence what the camera does when it's looking at a scene. How does the camera remove a color cast? Well, if it's photographing what it thinks is a warm scene, it's going to add blues to it to sort of bring that back to a neutral. If it's photographing in the shade and sort of a cool scene, it's going to add warms, it's going to add oranges and yellows and pull it back towards neutral. That's what the camera's trying to do when you're taking pictures like this, is it's trying to bring it back to neutral. And if it's being told it is a warm scene, it adds the blues. If it's being told that it's a cool scene, it adds the warmer colors, the oranges, to bring it back to that middle. So that brings us to the automatic white balance settings. And admittedly, these have gotten much better over the years. Modern cameras do a pretty decent job at using automatic white balance. It's not perfect, but it is better than it used to be. But essentially what the camera's doing then is it looks at the scene, determines what the whites are, and it makes its own decisions about what it needs to add to the scene to bring that white to a more neutral setting. So say you're photographing at golden hour. If you're an automatic white balance, that camera's going to see, oh, warm light, I need to add blues to bring this back towards sort of more neutral look. And likewise, if you're photographing in a very shaded area, it's going to think, oh, I need to add oranges, warmth to the scene to bring it back to the neutral. And that's what the automatic white balance setting is doing. It's looking at that, making its own decisions and going from there. The other settings on there, incandescent, that's a warmer light. What you're doing when you set it to incandescent is you're saying this is a warm scene and the camera is going to add blues to bring it back towards that middle. Likewise, if you're on an overcast day or in the shade, if you set it to the shade setting, it's going to add warmth to the scene to sort of bring it back. And then of course you've got the manual setting, which is you can set it to manual, and you can specifically choose what white balance you want in Kelvin for the scene you're photographing, and it'll stay constant regardless of where the camera's pointed. And I think this is where some of the confusion with white balance comes in, is because when you're choosing your white balance, you're telling the camera what the scene is, and then the camera is adding the opposite color to bring you back to neutral. So for example, if I'm photographing a scene in daylight, right there, a fairly neutral spot in the Kelvin scale, and if I am photographing that scene, but I tell my camera, oh, incandescent, well, you've now told the camera that you're photographing a warm scene, and it's going to add blue to remove the color cast in order to bring you to neutral. But if you're already at neutral and it's adding blue, it makes the scene much cooler. If you're photographing a scene that's daylight, again, right there in the middle, and you tell the camera that you're photographing under cloudy skies, well, the camera's gonna say, oh, that's a cool setting. I need to add warm orange tones to it in order to neutralize that. Well, if I'm already at neutral and I add orange warm tones to the image, it's gonna move it to have a warmer feel for it. And I think that's where the confusion comes in, because it's like, it's cloudy, why is it making it warmer? Or it's incandescent, why is it making it cooler? It's not that you're applying that to it, it's that you're telling the camera what you're photographing, and it's taking the opposite action to sort of remove that color cast to get it to neutral. So that's what the camera's doing when you change white balance settings. Let's talk about what I recommend and how I set my camera for my landscape photography. Okay, so we've talked about white balance in general. We've talked about what the camera is doing when you're choosing various white balance settings. Let's talk about what I recommend people set their white balance to for landscape photography. Now, before I say what my setting is, there's one key piece to this advice for it to work. You have to be photographing in RAW. Now, I've talked about many times about the value of photographing in RAW. You have the most data in your file. And the other advantage RAW gives you complete flexibility with your white balance to adjust it in post-processing. You can photograph in one way and use your post-processing software to make white balance changes and have full flexibility. Whereas with a JPEG file, that white balance has started getting baked into the file. You can make some subtle adjustments to your temperature of your image if you want a little warmer, a little cooler, but you lose a lot of flexibility. And so my suggestions, my recommendations for a landscape photographer, what to set your white balance to, is contingent on you shooting in RAW. So if you're shooting in RAW, this advice is great. If you're not shooting in RAW, I recommend trying to start shooting in RAW, and then these white balance settings will also apply to you. So that brings us to, what are my white balance settings on my camera? And the way I have my cameras configured is I have them set to manual white balance, and I set my Kelvin to 5600. This puts me at a nice neutral spot and is the same across all of my images. I always know I'm pretty much at 5600, and it's sort of that neutral, and I can change and adjust to how I saw the scene in my post-processing software. So why manual instead of auto? Well, manual gives me consistency. I always know in all the images I catch where I'm at, what my white balance is. It's one less thing to think about in the field, or if I'm doing some sort of bracketing or something like that, my white balance is staying consistent at how it was shot through the scene, which can make post-processing a little easier. So that's why I go towards the manual setting. It's just, since it's something that can be changed in post-processing, it's just one less thing to think about in the field while remaining consistent. So because I shoot that way, there are times where an image will come into Lightroom looking a little goofy from the color temperature. And so we're gonna take a look at an image here in Lightroom. I'm gonna show you how it came in, just so that if you start shooting this way and you start pulling images in, you don't panic and go, ah, this looks terrible. So let me show you that in Lightroom. So here we are with an image that I pulled into Lightroom. I've done some edits on this in the past, but I have, for the purpose of this video, gone in and set the white balance to as shot. Now this is a raw file, as shot. Here we are, 5600 Kelvin, 5650, and that's what I shoot at. It's a neutral setting. Now this particular scene was shot with a bright blue sky, so that's bringing in lots of blue color cast, and then it was shady in this area as well. So lots of contributing factors to make this a cool image. And I'd told my camera to shoot this at neutral, sort of at 5600. So that's why this image has blue tones to it. But because I shot in RAW, I have complete flexibility to change the temperature on this with no ill effect. So for example, I can warm this up, because in my head, this scene was a warmer scene, because this rock was actually much warmer than that. So I can warm this up. I'm gonna bring it up a fair amount, because like I said, it was a bright blue sky. We're gonna bring it up to around 8500. And as you can see, that warms it up. Now there is a bit of a tint to this, so we're gonna add a little bit of magenta because it went a little green. probably a little too much. Put it like right in there. And I was able to take this file that started at shot at neutral and give it the warmer feeling that I felt. This was a fall day, so I've got the warmer leaves over here. This rock was more of a gray to reddish color, so it warmed up. So I have that complete flexibility in Lightroom to do it. So let's look at the before and after. Here's the before. It's cool. I shot it in a neutral color. I had lots of color casting coming in that was blue. I'm able to come into Lightroom, use the white balance setting, and warm it back up, remove a little bit of the green tint when I did that. And we get that. Now, if you're a little uncomfortable adjusting the temperature, you can always let Lightroom give it a shot. There's an auto setting. So if you're like, man, I just don't even know what this should have looked like, you can set it to auto and adjust from there. I will sometimes do this, set it to auto and be like, well, okay, maybe I want it just a touch warmer. So I can use that auto setting though as a base to sort of bring it up a little bit. If you know it was cloudy, you can come in here and set it to cloudy. And then if you want to see it go askew, if we set this to tungsten, this is telling it it's very warm. Adobe's going to actually add even more blue. As you can see, a very ugly blue. And that's because I've told it, oh, this was shot under warm light, which it wasn't. It was shot under skylight. So what it does is it adds a bunch more blue. On an image that's already blue, it makes it even worse. Like I said, we'll go back, custom. This is what I set it to. So like I said, as long as you photographed in RAW, your post-processing software gives you lots of flexibility to work on the image and post-processing to get that feel, remove color cast, add a warmth, add coolness, whatever you need to do to it. And that's it. Those are my recommendations for how to set white balance on your camera for landscape photography, along with a little bit about what white balance is, how the camera works with white balance and what it's doing, my recommended settings, and then what you can do with it in post-processing to make those adjustments. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, and mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.